a collection of archipelagos. Large, expansive tropical forests. Vast rice fields and terraces. The world's most important shipping lanes. The contested waters of the South China Sea. As a collection of formerly colonized states that have to constantly make bargains to be independent and autonomous, Southeast Asia now plays a key role in the world's economy. In the age of great power competition between the United States and China, the region has newfound geostrategic importance, and Southeast Asian states are active participants in facilitating transition in the regional order. However, if it is that important, do we have enough understanding of Southeast Asia as a region? If Vietnam is culturally closer to the Chinese, why do we include it within the boundary of Southeast Asia to the north? If the Makassarese fisherfolk have for centuries fished in Darwin, why not include Australia within the boundary to the south? Why refrain from including Papua in the boundary to the east? And why place a line from Myanmar down to Aceh as the boundary to the west? What is Southeast Asia?
Okay, well, there's clearly at least two major ways to answer, and the one is the contemporary political of ASEAN and ASEAN's antecedents, and the fundamental rationale, I suppose, of ASEAN, which is we don't want to be China and we don't want to be India. Vietnam, of course, was looking from objectively from outside, you'd say, well, it's a bit Southeast Asian in environment and so forth, but it's very Chinese in culture and so forth. So, but the Vietnamese had spent 1,000 years insisting they were not Chinese, even though they emulated China and they read the classics and so forth. They were different, and that of course became even more pronounced with post-independence insistence that we are our own place. There was a chance, I suppose, that we would have used different words. The term India was actually applied. To both Indonesia and the Philippines. The colonial went on calling them Indians, India in Indonesia and Indio in the Philippines, because they were, coming from somewhere else. Everybody was sort of Indian, and so they distinguished this as further India. And when the Indian nationalists got excited about it, they called it Greater India. And that, of course, in turn, once nationalism started to be the game, and the Indians adopted India, then that wouldn't do. Of course, others rejected it and rejected this whole identification with India. And the same with Burma. Burma was part of India for 30 or 40 years under the British, but the Burmese nationalist movement was so emphatic that we are anti-Indian. The Southeast Asian Chinese and the Southeast Asian Indians were sometimes caught in that emphatic rejection. We're not India, we're not China. So that's the modern thing.
When you spend enough time in Southeast Asia, there is an influx of visual and sensory experiences that tell you you are indeed in Southeast Asia. For me, it boils down to two things. Something you cannot touch but can see, lack of empire that breeds nationalism and pride in having agency as a result of freeing itself from subjugation. And something that you can experience but can't take away with you. The living culture and environment of Southeast Asia that emerged from centuries of dynamic interplay between isolation and interaction.
Of what defines Southeast Asia politically was the lack of empires that consolidated and unified from above. Looking back at a longer reach of history, of course I was keen to stress the environmental factor. I mean, that's what I did in the Age of Commerce, and the first volume of that, trying to define this place, was to say, look at the way people eat, the way people produce their food, the way people grow rice and harvest rice, the way women have their prominent roles in the planting and harvesting of rice, in ceramics, I mean, there are, and in marketing, in particular in marketing, which of course made women have a lot of agency, a lot of autonomy, economically speaking, which is quite a marked difference from either China or India.
There are many myths about Southeast Asia that have been busted over time. Southeast Asia will be balkanized. They are bouncing against China. No, they are bandwagoning with China. Southeast Asian states have no choice, no agency. Misunderstanding of Southeast Asia as a region is deeply rooted and a product of Oriental tendencies and the instinct to impose outside theories onto a local context. This has contributed to the fall of many empires. Misunderstanding of the Acehnese contributed to the disastrous defeat of the first Dutch expeditions of 1873. Misunderstanding the Vietnamese brought the French and the Americans heavy losses. If Washington is not careful, this misunderstanding could cost the US a vital anchor of its hegemony in the region. One common denominator has been the underestimation on the importance Southeast Asian plays on having agency. Why do we keep getting Southeast Asia wrong?
Now, meeting the China Challenge was really my frustration with how I felt the published work in the English language, right, largely in American outlets, did not reflect the reality of how questions about how to manage US-China competition, how these debates were being carried out in the region. And I was frustrated at how a lot of the work really was talking about what the United States was thinking, but masquerading, US thinking as regional thinking, right? I was very annoyed by that. And I was primarily annoyed at the charge that I heard a lot in different places in the West, where people would say, in a very casual way, oh, Southeast Asians have no strategic thinking, right? Or Southeast Asians have no strategy. And to me, this was blatantly untrue. And what I was trying to show in meeting the China Challenge, but also in the subsequent works on Southeast Asian strategy, what I was trying to show was Southeast Asians have strategies. They just don't strategize the way Americans, or other strategic studies scholars thought strategy should occur.
Right.
So that was my main purpose.
Yes.
In meeting the China Challenge. Okay, so we know about Southeast Asia. Why should we care?
Right.
Well, we should care because even though they're small or medium-sized states, they actually have order ambitions. And because cumulatively their individual strategies, and collectively their regional institutional strategies are facilitating the creation of a particular kind of regional order. It's not just that we should care equally about small and big states. I'm not making that argument. I'm making the argument that in this case we needed to care about Southeast Asian strategies because with great intentionality and with some efficacy, their strategies were actually helping to bring about explicitly a certain kind of regional order.
We always have that mantra of we do not want to choose between great powers. We want to generate benefits from both of them if possible, and play them off of each other, perhaps even.
No, I think we need to clarify that not want to choose and being neutral or being independent. This is different things. Because we do need to choose, but our choices should be dependent on our key national interests.
Yes.
So, but within that, I think spectrum, sometime probably will be seen, like closer to US.
Yeah.
Sometime on other sectors, other issues will be seen closer at that time, closer to Soviet Union. So that's why the article that I wrote at the Asian Survey shows that, because different interests would, lead to different nuance, in our, foreign policy. But, the red line is really the free and, active principle. So that's, I think, to suggest that, the national interest should be the defining, foundations of any choices that we are going to make, now and also in the years to come.
And you see, again, for Southeast Asian countries, as a region, as a group of weaker countries, we are kind of unique in the sense that almost all of us, with the exception of Thailand, we were colonized. So it means that historical memory lead us to see the world. We recognize, we acknowledge power asymmetries. Big powers as realities, as given conditions, they mean two things for us. They can harm us and they can help us. US now offer us IPAF, right? So 7 out of 10 ASEAN countries, we are in IPAF. But we do that not because we want to please the United States or we are pro-US, right? We do that out of our own benefits. It helps us in maximizing economic benefits, mitigating economic risks that might happen in one way or another, right? For domestic needs as well. The same can be said about other powers' initiative. China's Belt and Road, right? Generally, majority countries are quite receptive with a varying different degree of receptivity, but generally we are positive. Vietnam is an exception. Vietnam is very cautious, and that is interesting because of geographical proximity. Should explain that Vietnam should be benefit more by BRI and China initiative, right? But they are the least, they are the most cautious one. That's one. And even economically, you see, Vietnam is already now overtaking Malaysia, right, as the largest trading partner of China in ASEAN region. And you would think that since they have been collaborating with China economically through trade, investment and all that, they should be flexible, right? They should be receptive. But in reality, you know that it is Vietnam continue to be very suspicious until today. So if ruling elites, we know in the region, they wake up not thinking about South China Sea, right? But it's a domestic challenges. So it's domestic.
Move your hips to the left, tilt your body to the right. Your left hand down and right hand up. Twist your palm while doing it. And as that happens, move your eyes slowly. Right and left, right and left. I think understanding Southeast Asia entails 2 steps and back and forth processes, like the Balinese Legong, observing with our eyes and entire body, left and right, left and right. To first learn how to ask better questions, and then to appreciate the multiplicity of answers as a result of the complexity and fragmentation of Southeast Asia as a region. How do we get Southeast Asia right?
But there's two sides to this, because it's that getting at other perspectives, which is the sort of practical side of, to my mind, of my interest in Southeast Asia, initially being one of trying to understand the emerging, which they were initially and still are in one sense, emerging and politically and culturally, emerging countries in this region, increasingly powerful countries in this region. So to me, it's the act of being an historian involves that sort of perspective, that sort of gauging, interrogating other perspectives, but it's also vital to what we contribute practically to our country. So when Clifford Geertz said what matters is not a whole lot of generalizations about human existence, but what makes, he said, Morocco different from Java. You know when you're in Morocco, you're in another Muslim country, but it's very different. Why? So that's an issue which Southeast Asians need to think about.
There are a lot of ways to convey intentions, right? And you wrote an article on translating a pause and silence for Journal of Malaysian Branch of Royal Adriatic Society in 2001. And in a way, it reminded me of my own work on tacit understanding, because I studied tacit understanding, and I remember that I have these sections called Negotiating in Silence, where Indonesian Foreign Minister Ali Alatas and Chen Chichen, Chinese Foreign Minister, basically negotiate, but a lot of the most important point was basically pause and smile. And then afterward, I have to do a lot of this contextual work where basically what it means. And obviously he talked about it after, and that gives me a little bit of context about what those smile and pose was.
That is a wonderful story about the body language involved and the really telling use of the pause or quickly interrupting, which is very difficult to reflect in writing. Most Asian languages are totally different from our European, Indo-European based Western languages. And English is a language that is extremely nuanced, especially for emotion. Yes, precise but nuanced. So you'll have lots of synonyms for something.
Many things that you don't understand, many cues that you don't pick up. And it's inevitable, it's a real shame. On the other hand, as an outsider, you have the privilege that people don't immediately embed you in the local politics, in the local relations. As an Australian, I was recognised as someone from a basically friendly country. I came as a friendly observer. And people explained things to me. I could ask simple questions and people would take the time and the trouble to give me a simple answer. I could ask follow-up questions. So there's big advantages in being an insider. There's also advantages in being an outsider.
The long experience of interacting with great powers has taught the region to hedge, not to place its eggs in any one great power basket, to create contingency plan, and to trust those who stay. The latter point, trust those who stay, reflect an acceptance by Southeast Asian states that they are geographically stuck with each other and therefore must collectively take the initiative to establish regional security mechanisms rather than relying on external powers. However, the emerging multipolar world is characterized by deep entanglement like never before. This fact, and particularly the region's close economic entanglement with China, has created an unprecedented challenge for Southeast Asian states. If it is difficult for the US to decouple from China, it is even more costly for Southeast Asian states. China's infrastructure investment creates more permanent entanglement, given it is increasingly intertwined with regime security and legitimacy? Can Southeast Asia continue to avoid invidious choices between the great powers?
Yeah, I think most of the ASEAN countries welcome the U.S. military presence, right, in the region. They see that as having a stabilizing effect, right? So, but I think the discourse that is emerging in maybe the majority of Southeast Asian countries is that if in the past the US was the predominant power, let's say in Southeast Asia, the hegemon, right? And given that China is rising, and given that the US is in relative decline compared to China, I don't think it's terminal decline, because we must never underestimate the US. Then the question is, should the US be making some adjustments? All right. I mean, Hugh White from formerly emeritus at ANU has, I think, put the problem very nicely. Is whether America is willing to share power. All right. And you would think that most in Southeast Asia are already saying that there's not a choice when the rising power, is already having that wherewithal, and as Lowy says, 90% of America's power, right? But I don't think the US is ready yet to share power, and I think that partly explains the US position. And as some Chinese, Xi Jinping has said, the US is actually containing us, encircling us, and before that, that statement a few months ago, he never said that. Right. So there's the sense in China that the US is indeed pursuing a containment policy. And the op-ed writers in the Financial Times, like Edward Luce, they say this is containment straight. All right. It's just that the US is not putting it in those terms. And so, and I think, to me, if I want to describe what the US is doing, I don't think containment is that bad a concept. Because people who say that, containment is not going to work, right? But you want to separate the workability or the potential consequence of containment with the US trying. All right? Because to me, during the Cold War, containment meant the US trying to prevent the expansion of Soviet power. I mean, US policy in the last few years since Trump is about preventing the expansion of Chinese power and influence in the region. So in that broad notion, I think you can say that it is containment. But whether it will work, it's a different matter.
Definitely. And in a way, it is almost like a contest of analogy. Sorry, contest of analogy, because on the one hand, United States perhaps not articulating it, but wanting to view it in that lens of competitions, and then the region and China, but also the region in a very different way said, hey, don't use that analogy, especially Southeast Asia region that keep telling them to change their mind and think about it from a non-zero sum way, right? And in a way, it becomes like, can you revise your analogy and think about it differently? And I guess it's the same thing with the whole George Ball story. Of a Ball story of trying to change the mind that's already quite set. Right, and the competition, looking at China as a competitor is already a bipartisan view. And if can the region change, can Southeast Asian country change United States' mind?
Wow. Okay. I think that, there'll be limits to how far, not just Southeast Asia, the rest of the world, right? Even the EU, friends of America, well-wishers of America, they can always advise, not advise, I mean urge the US to, form more habits of communication, more dialogue, more negotiations, and whether that will fall on receptive ears is very very hard to say. I mean, ASEAN can argue, for example, that as one of our colleagues said recently, it has convening power, right? As Zhou Liao said, and therefore ASEAN is always, or Singapore or or Indonesia is always ready to be the venue where the great powers can get together to have more meaningful conversations. But I think in the next few years this is going to be tough, because I think both of them have come to the conclusion that they mean one another harm.
So to relate to your empirical example of Mahathir 2.0 when he came back to power in 2018, and then on the way he handled Belt and Road Initiative and also the related China-related issues, are all reflective of a small state pragmatism, recognizing all those structural constraints and possibility, and also the risk of uncertainties. But still, we need to be pragmatic and active, and sending nuanced signals. So what Mahathir did was that, and that was from 2018 onwards, right? He said that because of public unhappiness about ECRL and some of the 1MDB implicated projects, so what he did was he suspended 3 out of many China projects. At the same time, he keep emphasizing, right? Whenever he talk about this issue, he keep emphasizing Malaysia supports Belt and Road. And the successful renegotiation in 2019, April 2019, helped Mahathir, right, to settle this very touchy issue, and also restore Malaysia-China relations with all this uncertainty about the South China Sea. And to Mahathir, I can see very clearly from his statement and actions that when he deal with Belt and Road, he also have South China Sea in mind. Because it was during the same interview that the moment he talked about Belt and Road, he talked about South China Sea. And again, South China Sea, his approach is very nuanced. He only used certain words, right? Warship attracts warships. By that 3 words, he implies the power asymmetry consequences. He also implies that he is not blaming everything on one power, right? There is a power action reaction. He shows that he is very concerned, very prudent. He also see the interlinkages between all these issues, right? Belt and Road, economic development issue. South China Sea, security territory issue. But as smaller country, he realized that all these issue linkage, right? And how smaller countries can survive all these uncertain big power interaction is that you need to be pragmatic, right? So you need to balance some defiance and differences, but you also need to make sure that the core interests for us have to be preserved.
As the region change, that concept of, because CISCAP is part of the Asia Pacific initiative, right? And now there's a new concept of Indo-Pacific that carries different strategic imaginaries and different proposal. Do you think that with this new concept, it undermines the prior Asia Pacific ideas and initiative like CISCAP, or does it complement it and offer opportunities? And obviously thinking about the relevance of ASEAN in this context.
So of course, what we need now is, I think, to reinvigorate, rejuvenate, the CISCAP, to be able to deal with the current, challenges, the current reality. Probably, because again, CISCAP is based on the activism of each think tank, which is a member of the CISCAP. When this think tank are having a problem domestically in each national setting, the CISCAP will have a problem too. So now I think as we focus more on the Indo-Pacific, and I think it's the only platforms available for that is the East Asia Summit. Now it is important to start thinking about what sort of track to process that can actually help the institutionalization of the East Asia Summit. Because CISCAP was formed in order to help the ASEAN Regional Forum.
Yes, which Wayne.
I don't have any confidence in ASEAN Regional Forum anymore.
Right.
So it's better to focus on the East Asia Summit. Then CISCAP should be remodeled or readjusted in order to live up to that new realities and needs of the regions.
Right.
You don't need to change it into like Indo-Pacific Council of Security Cooperation, but the function of it should be geared toward helping and supporting the East Asia Summit to become the premier regional platform for member state to actually exchange ideas, to have more dialogue and work on practical areas as well. Right. If you remember the process at the time, there was something called Ali Alatas paper.
Yes.
Right. Late Ali Alatas came up with a paper on how the ASEAN Charter should be drafted, and it contained a lot of great provisions. But that proposal, of course, get watered down, by the official process, of ASEAN. So the charter that we have now was passed in 2008 as a result of compromise. There were a lot of problems because many of the provisions within the charter are not really operationalized. And then the biggest problem is actually when we have to deal with Myanmar issue, then there are a lot of constraints within the charter that make it difficult for ASEAN to really address that particular problem. That's why I again think that it's time probably to look at the charter again, and then look at where it become a constraint, where it can facilitate the work of ASEAN, and then revise it. Probably we need to think about the protocol of certain aspect or certain provision within the charter. They're probably more acceptable, more palatable to ASEAN countries.
Southeast Asia is a paradox. It is a consequence of colonialism and labels imposed from outside, but it is also a decision of states that have chosen to empower themselves. It comprises entities that reject the idea of empire, but founded on political identities shaped by the idea of empire. Such dualities and hybridity define what Southeast Asia is, what makes it an inherently difficult region to understand. But what is Southeast Asia? Can this question ever be answered?